Hi, everyone. This is a summary of Jeffrey Morgan's chapter entitled, Can We Have Ethics Without Religion? So I'm just going to give a brief summary of it and hit the highlights. So this chapter is about divine command theory and natural law theory. I think he does a good job of explaining both of these theories in concise terms. And at the end of the chapter, he gives a brief description on how he thinks religious beliefs and practices support living a moral life. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into the first theory, that is divine command theory of morality. So divine command theory of morality is like it sounds. It just defines what is right or wrong on what God commands. So it says here, the divine command theory of morality, or DCT, is a relatively simple theory of moral obligation that equates our moral duties to the commandments of God. For example, X is morally obligatory if and only if God has commanded X. And Y is morally prohibited if and only if God has forbidden Y. Moreover, he says, the DCT, or divine command theorist, holds that God's commands are the source of morality. So, what are the strengths and weaknesses of divine command theory? Well, he goes through some of the strengths above. It's very clear and straightforward, at least it's supposed to be, but there are some weaknesses, some traditional challenges to this theory of ethics. And I'll read what he says here. The challenge is sometimes called the Euthyphro Dilemma, as it is expressed in Plato's dialogue, Euthyphro. To understand the challenge, suppose that God exists and has forbidden adultery. Then adultery is immoral, according to divine command theory. However, is adultery immoral because God forbids it? Or does God forbid adultery because it is immoral? Whatever our response, puzzles arise. So you've got this dilemma, you've got the horns of the dilemma, which means you've got these two choices, which neither one is ideal, or each one is accompanied by certain problems. So he says here, if we go with the one horn of the dilemma, he says, on the one hand, if God forbids adultery because it is immoral, then God has reasons for the command. Now, this is a problem he explains in this paragraph below, because if God has reasons for the command, then there are reasons that exist outside of God, meaning there's something else outside of God that makes something like, say, adultery wrong and not God himself. But remember, this is divine command theory, and according to the theory, it's supposed to be God that makes things right or wrong, not something else. And so this really undermines the theory. On the other hand, if we take the other side of the dilemma, like this, we say, if adultery is wrong because God forbids it, then we must accept that God's commandments are arbitrary. So if, in fact, it is wrong, like something like adultery is wrong just because God forbids it, then it seems like God could command anything to be right or wrong, and it's just right or wrong based on whether God commands it, and there's no other reason making the command somewhat arbitrary. So this is the dilemma, and there have been philosophers in recent times who have tried to offer some explanation or resolution to it. Christian philosopher William Lane Craig, he says here, argue that the Euthyphro presents a false dilemma, which is the fallacy of assuming that there are just two options, when in fact there are multiple options. Craig argues that God is essentially good, meaning that goodness is part of God's nature. Craig says there's a third alternative, namely, God wills something because he is good. What do I mean by that? I mean that God's own nature is the standard of goodness, and his commandments to us are expressions of his nature. In short, our duties are determined by the commands of a just and loving God. So this seems to get us out of the dilemma, but Morgan is not as convinced by this answer. He says God's own nature is the standard. If we say that God's own nature is the standard of goodness, he says, then saying that God is just and loving means that whatever God does would be equally just and loving. And this seems to be the arbitrariness option, albeit in a disguised form. So it seems to commit the second of those problems of the two horns of the dilemma. There's another philosopher, Robert Adams, who suggested a modified divine command theory. And according to his theory, Morgan says, Adams understands the divine command theory as articulating the equivalence between our moral obligations and the commands of a loving God. So it's not just that God commands it, or it's not God's nature, whatever that is. It's we identify God's, as I understand Adams here, we identify God as being a loving God independently of God's commands, and then whatever God commands must be the right thing because he is a loving God. Okay, that takes us to the next theory in this chapter, and that's called the natural law theory of morality, or NLT. So what is natural law theory? So it's the idea, he says, that the universe is created by God with everything holding a natural purpose. These purposes can be determined by careful study using our reason. And from knowledge of the proper purposes of objects, one can identify the proper ways to interact with the world and each other. So there are several principles that would define natural law theory for us. Number one, he says, God created the universe, including human beings and other objects, with purposes. Number two, the purpose of objects in the world can be discerned using natural reason with which God has endowed human beings. So meaning we don't have to rely on any revelation like the Bible to tell us what is right or wrong. We can actually just look at nature, study nature to understand what is right or wrong. Number three, the purpose for which God created an object determines its proper use. So he says, one of the strengths of the natural law theory is that it allows us to perceive God's purposes without knowing God's commands or even believing that God exists. I know it says above that point one of natural law theory is that God created the universe, but natural law theory is still compatible with even a deistic worldview, meaning a view that God created the universe and endowed purpose and meaning into it, but then is no longer is on the scene, went on vacation or what have you. So that's possible. All we need here is to know God's commands. All we need is to study nature with our own reason. So that's one idea. And second, he says, the idea of an object's function is not as clear as the theory suggests. So here he goes into, in this paragraph, he goes into some of the problems of the theory. And I just want to focus on this one. So it's notoriously, natural law theory gets into trouble when it comes to specifics. Like when we study an object, whether it's a thing in nature or the human body, its function is not as clear as the theory suggests. He says, even if we allow that, say, sex is for reproduction, he continues on with this adultery example, it does not follow that it is only for reproduction or that it could not be used for other purposes. And he continues, some proponents of the natural law theory will respond to this line of thinking in interesting ways, developing, for example, a doctrine of double effect. Okay, the last part of this chapter is about, basically he explains what are some of the benefits of religion in ethics and what does it do to help make us more ethical. I thought this was a great way to round up the section. I will provide a link to this chapter in the description down below, and I do hope you found this summary helpful.